Good evening. Welcome to our class. We are in Romans, and we really still are. We are still in Romans, but we're taking kind of a. I'm just going to say we're taking a little migration as we begin to study some Hebrew history to help us understand some of the things that Paul is going to say in chapters 10 and 11 of Romans. And so we are looking at the tribes of Israel, and I will say this, I have been looking at this, of course I've been looking at this probably for 7 or 8 years personally doing this study. And this week I was just reading some passages in Isaiah in light of some of our recent study, and it was like anybody you're reading, you may have read a certain passage like 20 times, and all of a sudden you read it and it's like a light bulb goes off. And I was reading the 49th chapter of the book of Isaiah, and I'm going, oh my goodness, that's what this has been saying. It's very, very interesting because we're going to be looking at the migration patterns of the tribes, which we're not there yet. We're just looking at the tribes. And we're on Judah. We haven't moved very far. We're in Judah. The fourth son out of the 12. But things I never saw before in the same light, I see them. And the reason why, and then I went over into the 54th chapter and some other chapters in Isaiah, and I'm thinking, yes, because guess what? The directions are the very directions of the migration. When they left that area, it's the very direction from which they will return to that area. Okay, so we are on page 5. And we are at note 20. And we have been dealing with the descendants of Zara, Judah. Remember, Judah had 2 sons by Tamar, his daughter-in-law. Excuse me. Okay, could someone please go to the door and let Brother Terry and Sandy in? They were late, and I told them to text me, and they let them in. I know you're at home and you want to know who Brother Terry and Sister Sandy are. They're class members who were very courteous enough to let me know they're going to be late, and so they have to have someone let them in the door. So I will tell you, this YouTube video is more unique than probably any. We open the door for people, we answer our phones, we do all sorts of things that other people don't do. That just proves we're human. So Judah had 2 sons by Tamar, his daughter-in-law. And one of them was Pharez and one of them is Zara. And we've been looking at the descendants of Zara, Judah. So on note 20, on page 5, we see that the descendants of Zara, Judah, or most of the descendants of Zara, decided to leave their brethren and flee Egypt, to some new land or lands where they could establish independent kingdoms of their own. And I'm going to stop here for just a second and tell you that remember when God spoke to Abraham and Sarah, he said that kingdoms would come out of them. So remember, when the children of Israel were in Egypt, they were not in bondage the whole time. They had some freedom. Obviously, when Joseph arose to power, obviously his relatives and friends would have an opportunity to go and come back, and they were free to do that. So they made the decision to leave Egypt. And history records that they divided into 2 or more groups. So they divided into 2 groups as they left Egypt. And they went across the Mediterranean Sea. The Mediterranean Sea. And if you have a map, you can see the Mediterranean Sea. And they went in different directions. And the Bible, you know that the Bible has history in it. And the Bible has accurate history. So if you have your Bibles open, I pray that you do as you're joining us. Go with me to 1 Chronicles. We're going to go to 1 Chronicles chapter 2. And we are going to pick up at verse 6. So the Bible says the sons, now I said that sometimes it'll look like Zara, sometimes it'll look like Zara, sometimes it'll look like Zara. It's the same person. And we know that because Hebrew is a consonant language with no vowels. The vowels were just added later by the Masoretes, who basically, and we call that, they gave vowel points. And so that you could pronounce a word. How many of you can't pronounce a word that's all consonants? You have to have vowels to pronounce it. So they added the vowels because in other words, the pronunciation in Hebrew, I know it's been a long time since some of you took Hebrew, probably forgot much of what we looked at. But remember, you couldn't pronounce Hebrew. You couldn't pronounce Hebrew. So the pronunciation was passed on. However your grandparents pronounced it, they passed it on to your parents, and they passed that pronunciation on to you. So then, in the 4th century, they decided to put vowel points in so you could pronounce and actually read Hebrew. So, same person. I said all that to say it's the same person. So it says the sons of Zara were Zimri, Ethan, Heman, Calcol, and Dara. 5 of them in all. And actually, descendants. Sometimes when you're reading the Bible and you'll see son, the sons, sometimes it just means descendants. And sometimes you can have a generation or more skipped. It has to do with records. Some of you may know your great-great-grandparent, and somehow something got lost and you don't know the next one, the great-great-grandparent, and then you get the grandparent. So, but they were descendants of Zara. So Calcol, and by the way, he's also known as Cecrops, so if you're going to do some study looking for that person in history, you may find him as Cecrops, and I've given you the name there in parentheses. A great-grandson of Zara, okay, is Calcol. So, and that we just know from records. So, like I said, descendant of Zara. So Calcol and his group fled to the area of Greece. And have been credited with the founding of the city of Athens. I've never heard of Athens. Yes, Athens, Greece. And I want you to keep in mind, this is migration prior to the exodus from Egypt under Moses. That's how early these migrations were made. Another group was led by Dara. He's also known as Darda. He can also be known as Dardanus. It would be the same as John, could be Jack, John, or Jonathan. But this group, and it doesn't matter, but I personally are looking very carefully at the name and the pronunciation of the name Darda and Dardanus. I'm going to tell you that as we move through these migrations. And they ended up in the Troad region of Anatolia, and here's why I say about the Dardanelles. They are bounded by the Dardanelles. Where do you think they got that name? From Dardanelles. They left names as they migrated. They left their name. They left footprints so that you can know these people in the northwest. Now, this area that we're talking about, Troad, Anatolia, the Dardanelles. Now, this name, I'm sure you're going to be familiar with. This area was known as Galatia in Paul's day. Anybody ever hear of Galatia?
Yes.
Anybody ever read the Galatians? Yes, it was written to the churches in Galatia. Today, that region is known as what country? Turkey. Its historical capital was Troy. You ever heard of Troy? Yeah. Ever hear of the Trojan horse? Yes, you've heard of Troy. So Dara, or Darda, became the ancestor of the Trojans. Now do you see we're beginning to pick up some breadcrumbs of where the tribes went, who they are, who they became. They disappeared, and what you're going to see, they disappear in one area, and they show up in another area by another name, but they've still left footprints to say, aha, I know who these people are. So, and that was, by the way, early on when they were in Egypt. So, note 21. Not long prior to the Exodus. So now we're moving along in Egypt. Now we're getting closer to the Exodus under Moses. Gathalus, also called Miled, a son of Calcol. And now we're dealing with a son of Calcol. Returned to Egypt because they had the freedom to go and come back. He comes back to Egypt. After joining the Pharaoh at that time in his conflict with the Ethiopians, because now you've got Egypt and now they're in a battle with Ethiopia, and Gathalus helps the Pharaoh. So Gathalus, and you say, well, where are we going with this? Hang with me a little bit. We're picking up breadcrumbs that's going to become a loaf, okay? So Gathalus, because he helped the Pharaoh battle the Ethiopians, he's given the Pharaoh's daughter, who happens to be called Scota, in marriage. Now, all I'm going to say is, do you remember some of the things we looked at last week? And what country we were talking about last week? Okay. So he's given Scota in marriage. 7 years later, as we're getting closer and closer to the Exodus, Gathalus and Scota fled from Egypt at the beginning of the plague. So now we're we're right at the door of the Exodus. And they fled from Egypt at the beginning of the plagues and traveled to the region of Spain and Portugal. It's interesting to note that this region is referred to as Iberia, and it basically comes from Hebrew. Linguistically, that's where it comes from. So he and his family settled, and they remained for a number of years in this area, giving it, of course, the name Iberia. And during their time in this region that we know as Spain today, Gathalus and his family founded a city which still bears the name of their ancestor Zara. Zara. And that area is called Zaragoza. Zaragoza. And Zaragoza is around the area of the Strait of Gibraltar. So you have North Africa, and then you have the Strait of Gibraltar, and then around this area right here is Zaragoza. Now remember, because unfortunately today I find in modern culture that the terms Jew, Israel, Hebrew all get homogenized. And we need to understand they are separate. Okay? So remember that these descendants of Zara were Hebrews. They were descended from Eber, also known as Heber, who was, now you know why I told you to go and get these charts, because they're very important, because you can then look for yourselves as you go down through these names, because he was a great-grandson of Shem. Remember, Noah had 3 sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. And Eber is the great-grandson of Shem through Abraham. So I want us to go to Genesis 14:13. Genesis 14:13. You will see this. Then one who had escaped came and told Abram the Hebrew, for he dwelt by the terebinth trees of Mamre. So Abraham in the 14th chapter of Genesis is called a Hebrew. Abraham is called a Hebrew. That's right after Genesis 14:13. That's to fill in. Abraham is called a Hebrew. Thus Judah and his sons Zara and Pharez were Hebrews. Both of them were Hebrews. So now what do we see? We have Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then Judah. Judah should be in there next. That was left out, and I had already typed it and printed it. So you can, under Jacob, put Judah, and then under Judah you have Zara and Pharez. Does everyone see where I said to the okay? Now, so is everyone clear up to now? Any questions? Okay, because if you have questions, I know people at home have questions, and they can't ask them, you can. Well, they can ask them, by the way, you can't ask me questions if you're at home, but you'll have to call in and give me the question, and then I can answer it at the next class period. Yes, Sandy?
20, the last, today the region is known as, I'm going to get that.
Turkey, Turkey, that is the country of Turkey.
The whole thing, and was,
Troy.
Troy.
Its historical capital was Troy, and thus Dar or Darda became the ancestor of the Trojans, Trjans, and I'm sure when you were in school you heard about the Trojan horse. You're welcome. And there are some conflicts that are still going on today, and I can tell you that there is a conflict even today between Greece and Turkey. It's still going on today. So as Zara and his descendants traveled, they left this name like tracks on a trail, marking their journey to distant lands. So as they traveled, they dropped their name. You hear the term name dropping? Well, they did. They dropped their name as they were traveling. The river on the banks of the city of Zaragoza is to, and it's not is, it should be this day. It is called the Ebro, E-B-R-O. But you see, again, they dropped their name on a site that we have here. It's 2022, and that's still the name of the river. And to the land itself they gave the name Iberia, the land of the Iberi or Hebrews. So they go, they migrate, they're in this land, and they said, this is the land of the Iberi. This is the land of the Hebrews, because we are Hebrews. Now, any question on that? So after residing for some time in Spain, Gathalus died. And his widow Scotta, along with their sons, left the land and traveled northward to what we know today as Ireland and Scotland. But they were first in Ireland. So they're in Ireland. And guess what? Now comes name dropping again, right? Now, I want you to keep remembering some prophetic words God gave to Abraham and Sarah. Out of you will come what? Kings. Instead of Sarah, you will be a mother to kings. And nations will come out of you. Yes, Virginia?
Did you say Ireland or Scotland?
Ireland, and then I gave you a little note, and there were also some who ended up in Scotland, and we'll go there, but Ireland right now. So once again, guess what? They took their identification with them. And they called their new home Hiberi land, because now they migrated, and now they basically brought back the H sound in their name. And they called that Hibernia. Hibernia, Hibernia. So what you're seeing is they're dropping their identity where they have migrated. And if you will look on ancient maps, and I don't know if I gave you, I don't think I passed these out. That's my fault. So just shoot me, but just wait till after I finish teaching. And I'm giving you, if you're at home, you're going to have to call me. You have to call me. So you have to ring me up on the phone and leave a message that you need this map. And you will see, this is the area of Hibernia. That's Ireland. They named it that. And then when we get into Scotland, there's a country very close to it on this map, which is called Scotia. And if you're in class, in person, see me at the end of class. I will pass these out to you. I have big ones, I have little ones. The big ones are bigger, but the little ones are clear. So, and you'll see I said refer to an ancient map of this area, and then I didn't pass it out, so I'm sorry, I apologize. Now, it's also interesting to know that if you look at Hibernia, there are islands north of it. And does anyone know what those islands north of Hibernia or Ireland are called? They are called, thank you, Mike Anderson. Thank you. You get the star tonight. The Hebrides. The Hebrides Islands. Again, now how many are seeing connection now? They dropped their name, and it's. By the way, I hope I had somebody nodding their head at home, because nobody raised their head here. How many are seeing some connections now? Yes. Hibernia, Hebrides. They're dropping their name wherever they go. And that is helping us know what? where they migrated? Because this is the very direction the Bible says they migrated to. So with Aramon as their king, these descendants of Zara, Judah, founded the kingdom of Ulster in Northern Ireland. How many remember we looked at the flag of Ulster last week? So shortly after the Exodus, until the present day, the emblem of Ulster has been a red hand. And of course the red hand comes from what? Zara having been born first with the red cord, circled with a scarlet cord or thread, because he came out first. So understand, they may have moved from Egypt into Spain and all the way up into Ireland, and later they did move into Scotland. But guess what? They did not forget, you know, when a group feels they've been wronged, they will keep. How many know? This is my rightful, I was really the firstborn, and I know my identity. So what do? They use the red hand with the scarlet cord, saying, this will show you who we are. We're very grateful for that. Why? Because if we want to know where some of the tribes of Israel have gone, they've left us proof. So since the division of Ireland, and you know that Ireland has divided into Northern Ireland and Ireland, in 1920, the official coat of arms of Northern Ireland shows the red hand alone without the scarlet cord. But this fact does not alter the fact that the ancient and traditional emblem of Ulster was and still is a red hand circled by a scarlet cord. Now we're going to talk. Now, remember, Scotta left Spain with her sons and went into this area. So the use of the red hand as a family ancestry emblem is not just confined to Ulster or even to just Ireland, but in Scotland. How many know that you can see something in the name Scotland? Scotta. In Scotland, it is found in the coat of arms of several old families and at least 14 clan chiefs. And by their use of the red hand, some of the people, now please hear what I'm saying, some of the people of Scotland also point to their Hebrew origins as descendants of the Zara branch of the tribe of Judah. And notice what I'm saying is not that every person living in Ireland, nor every person living in Spain, nor every person living in Scotland is of the tribe of Zara, Judah. What I'm saying is that's where they went. They dropped their name, and there are people there, descendants of Zara, Judah. How many know that what I've said? I'm not saying. So we're not into replacement theology. We are into that. That's where they went, and there were groups of them there. And here's the key. They always become the head and not the tail. What do I mean by that? Wherever they went, they rose to prominence. In other words, does that mean every person living in the area that we know as Ireland today is of the tribe of Judah? No. But the promise that God gave to Abraham and Sarah, kings would come out of you, you will be the father of many nations. Do you understand what that was saying? Is wherever your descendants go, what? They're going to rise to the top. And by the way, if you want to know where the hatred, the desire to murder and wipe out these people, it comes because of God's favor. Because God said that's what's going to happen. You're going to rise, and they did. Now the Scots, note 27, the Scots who later invaded. Now see, you had Scots who later invaded what is now Scotland in 501 AD. Now they went later. How many of those? That's like really later. But guess what? They have among their emblems the red hand. And they were called Scots. So I don't have to tell you what happened. People migrate. How many of you live in a different area than your siblings? Maybe even a different state, different part of the country. Okay? Now we can see this. What happened? There were descendants of Scots that didn't go to the north toward Ireland right away. They went in another direction, but in 501 AD, they entered and invaded what is now Scotland. Sometimes people go away and come home. Some of my ancestors landed very, 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 very early in Virginia and moved to Ohio, the Ohio Valley area. And guess what? For a time, I went and lived in Virginia. Guess what? I came home. And that happened. So there was migration that was going on just like that. But in 501 AD, guess what? They came into the same area where some of their ancestors had moved prior. So guess what? Their emblem was still the red hand. Why? That was something they kept. They might not have remembered their language. They might not have remembered. There were some things that were ingrained in them, and one of them was the red hand. Why? Because our ancestor was born first. He was really the firstborn. And they carried that with them. And that has been associated with Ulster since around 1350 BC. And in 501 AD, it was still hanging around. Now, not all of the Scots came from Ulster. Their own historical records state that a large number of them came from Scythia. And just do me a favor and just say, okay, I'm going to post a note that and put it over here somewhere. And remember that, because I'm going to have to go through where we come to Scythia. Anyone know where Scythia, the term Scythia or Scythians comes from? Syria. Okay, no, it comes from Isaac. Just put that underneath your post-it note. How many remember Isaac?
Yeah.
Okay. But I don't. How many know you have to layer things? And I can't. I'm just giving you this, and then we'll go back and pick up some of this. And Scythia, which is the ancient name of the country to the west and north of the Caspian Sea. And I will give you, like I said, I'm sorry I didn't, but north and west, this is the Caspian Sea. This is what is good to note, because these Scots somehow migrated from Egypt over here this way when other ancestors migrated this way, and yet they will still end up together. So the declaration of our growth, and I've given that to you. I would say it's well worth it. If you are really interested in this, look it up. You can look it up online. If you're not online, you can go to the library and look it up the old-fashioned way. Some of you probably are so young you don't know anything about the cards. Remember, you have the Dewey Decimal System cards. Well, you can look up the Declaration of Arbroath, because this is an official letter sent to the Pope by the Parliament of Scotland, and it was signed by a very famous king, King Robert the Bruce, in 1320. And it should be 1320 AD. And it clearly stated that this branch of the Scots came directly from Scythia, and that should be Scythia, after living, now here's what's interesting, after living for a long period of time in, guess where? Spain. Now do you understand we're pulling some threads together and weaving them together? When Scotta and her husband went to Spain, okay, then her husband died, she moves with her sons, they go up toward what we now know as Ireland and Scotland. But then during the Declaration of Arbroath, there were other Scots who came from the area of Scythia, and guess what? They said, listen, we want to make a declaration to the Pope. We came directly from Scythia after living for a long period of time in Spain. So they got from here all the way over here in Scythia. Why? Because people do what? Even in that day, people did what? Travel. And they did. So this document states that they moved from Spain to the country now known as Scotland. And they said, 1,200 years after the outgoing of the people of Israel. Now, the people of Israel would be who? That would be the northern kingdom of Israel. And this time frame lines up because this 722 BC, Samaria fell. The northern kingdom of Israel fell. So if you add 1,200 years to that, because the Declaration of Arbroath said we came in 1,200 years after the outgoing of the people of Israel. Well, that would be around 500 AD. That's when they were. Now I know some, you'll have to maybe sit down, that's why I've given you the dates, and so you can see 1,200 years from 722 BC. That would be about right. That's about 700 years, and 700 and 500 is what? 1,200. So you can see it because you gotta do the 722 is about 688, and then the 500 more, that would give you that 1,200 years. Okay. So there are two possibilities of how this migration occurred. This branch of the Scots originally came to Spain with Gathalus. Remember Gathalus? And he himself came originally from Scythia, and then elected to stay in Spain when Scotta and her sons moved into what is now Ireland. Okay? Because sometimes family, sons sometimes stay in a place and other brothers move other places, right? So then they could have joined the rest of their family because Scotta and her sons moved into what is now Ireland, and then they joined the rest of their family in Scotland many years later after a long stay in Spain. And this branch may have come as the result, and now here we know because of the timing, the 1,200 years, then they could have joined the rest of the family many years later, and this branch may have come as the result of the deportation of the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom of Israel to Assyria. And that deportation started in 722 BC with the fall of Samaria, and then it was completed in 718 BC. So this branch of the Scots would have arrived in Scotland around 483 AD, and probably some didn't come to probably 500 AD. And that comes close to the declaration of Arbroath, and that's supposed to be Arbroath. That's a typo. It also brings us very close to the year 501 AD. And 501 AD is the date that Scottish history gives as the date for the Scots' arrival in the region. How many know God may move his people like chess pieces on a chess game, but everything is going to line up, date-wise, direction-wise, okay? Any questions? I know that was a little bit confusing.
Yeah, it's the dates.
Okay, so let me pull the strings together. So the Scots, you had them coming from Egypt, going into Spain, called that area Iberia after Hiberi, their identification. They were Hebrews. Then you had some who, Scota, then moved with her sons, some of them, all the way up into what we know today as Ireland, and they called it Hibernia, again, using their identification. There were some who didn't move at that time, and they moved in another direction. So they're ending up way east, and then they come at a later time after the migration of the 10 northern tribes. Okay? So this later branch of the Scots claims they came into Scotland from Scythia, from that area, over northwest of the Caspian Sea. And this is kind of interesting because they make mention of their stay in Spain. They said, we were in Spain, but they went immediately to the area we know as Scotland today. They did not stay in Ireland. Can you understand? Families do that. Some will move and they'll live in maybe 2 or 3 states. Somebody else may live in 1 state and then go to another state and come home to their original state. And what we don't realize is they moved just like people and families move today. So that leads me to believe that the red hand, because understand, you had people in what we now today know as Spain, Ireland, Scotland, and then way to the east around the Caspian Sea. But every one of these groups of people still have the red hand as their emblem. It's their family emblem. They never gave it up. They may have remembered and lost a great deal of their history, but they stuck to the red hand. And therefore, it had to be an ancestral emblem. Had to be. And also, it was the emblem which both branches, strangely enough, both branches of the Scots brought with them from some ancient homeland.
Ancient what?
Homeland. So in other words, you had people who went from Egypt into up the Mediterranean to Spain, then further up into Ireland and Scotland. You had other groups that left from Egypt, moving east over into the area of the Caspian Sea, but both of them had the red hand as their family emblem. The fact that this later branch of Scots dated their arrival from an event in the history of Israel. Notice how they said, we came here 1,200 years after after leaving Israel, after leaving the northern kingdom of Israel. And they said, we got here around 501, and they would have left the northern kingdom of Israel sometime between 722 BC and 518 BC. How many know that's real close to 1,200 years? And they have all that on there. Understand, if they are dating their arrival, they did. No one else did. No one put that on them. They said, we arrived 1,200 years after the going out of the children of Israel. If they did that, they would be highly unlikely to do this unless they themselves were Israelites. And also they state they came from Scythia, which is the location. Now here's the key. This is why we use history. We use documentation from history. And we go to the Word of God. That's our standard. And they state they came from Scythia, which is the location to which the people of the northern kingdom of Israel migrated after their departure from Assyria. When they were allowed to leave Assyria, that's the direction they took. Yeah, to the north and west. And the Bible says that's where they went. This is their direction they went. Yes, Reba?
So they were actually held captive in these.
They were held captive in Assyria. And then we know that that later, toward the very end of the Assyrian Empire, when before they fell to Babylon, there was some freedom that was given to certain people, and they were allowed. And they began then to migrate, and interestingly enough, they migrated north and west. North and west. So, considering the origin of the red hand that was recorded in Genesis 38, and the fact that a red hand became one of the emblems of the descendants of the Zara branch of the tribe of Judah, we can conclude that the people who brought the red hand to northern Ireland long ago, now those are people who came into Ireland. We're not saying all Irish people are this. We're saying that this is where they went. And the Scots, who later brought the same red hand to Scotland, what we know as Scotland, had a common origin in the Zara branch of the tribe of Judah. So as descendants of Zara Judah, the first settlers in northern Ireland, Ulster, guess what? They not only brought the red hand with them, but what else do you think they brought with them? They were entitled to use the rampant red lion. That's the red lion up on hind legs with both forepaws raised. And how many have seen that before? Last week we saw it on the flag. So the rampant red lion holds an important place in the official coat of arms of Northern Ireland. I would dare say many people living in Ireland today do not know where the rampant red lions came from. If you ask many of them, they'd say, well, I don't know why they're red. They're just red. It looked nice on our flag. That's why we like it. They don't know why they have the lion on the flag. And I've asked some Irish people. I said, why is there a Star of David on your flag? I don't know. That's just always, I don't know. I've always known that we had one. I don't know. And then I have some Irish family and friends. I said, do you know why the Star of David is on your flag? I don't know. I don't even know why they put that on there. Well, I mean, there's a reason for it being there. So another point of interest in these coat of arms is that the red hand has as its background a six-pointed star reminiscent of the Star of David. Any questions about that before we get to Dardanus? How many know that tribes of Israel are not lost to God. And they're not lost to the word of God. Now I want us to go to 1 Chronicles 2:6 again, because then we're going to look at another. So go with me to 1 Chronicles 2:6. By the way, it will all come together. It really will. So the sons of, and I'm going to say it Zara because that's how I put it in there. Zara were Zimri, Ethan, Heman, Calcol, and now we're going to look at another son, Dara. And we know that we're not talking sons, we're talking descendants. So just keep that in mind. Descendants. So then go with me to 1 Kings 4:32. Okay, actually it's 31. I'm sorry, it's 31. I'm going to read 32, but
What is it, King's?
big 1 Kings 4:31 and 32. Talks about Solomon's wisdom. And it says, for he was wiser than all men. And Ethan the Ezrahite, and Heman, Calcol, and Darda, the sons of Mahol. How many now are seeing why I said when we looked back before, it called them sons of, but they were descendants of. So here you see he was wiser than all men. Evidently, Ethan the Ezrahites and Heman, Calcol, and Darda, the sons of Mahol, all were very well known because it said, and his fame was in all the surrounding nations. So this lets us know we're going to look at another son, and this mentions another part of Zara's descendants, which fled out of Egypt under the leadership of another of Zara's great-grandsons, called Darda. Sometimes you're going to see it spelled Darda, sometimes you're going to see it spelled Dara. It's the Jewish historian Josephus. How many have heard of Josephus? He calls him Dardanus. Same person. So if you encounter, it's the same person. So Darda led a group northward across the Mediterranean Sea. So there they go again, across the Mediterranean Sea. They're coming from Egypt, they're going across the Mediterranean Sea to the northwest corner of Asia Minor. And under the rule of Darda, these descendants of Zara established a kingdom that was later called Troy. And they had a habit, the same habit. Guess what they did? Well, we're going to leave our name. We're going to leave our name where we go. So it is located on the southern shore of a narrow body of water which still bears his name, the Dardanelles. Dardanelles, D-A-R-D-A-N-E-L-L-E-S. Dardanelles. Just a southern shore, this body of water. Now this kingdom, and remember I told you about the Trojan Wars, this kingdom was destroyed by the Greeks in 1194 BC. So understand, remember, they leave Egypt. Okay. Now some of the survivors of this war now are going to flee. What does war do? Whenever there's war, what do people, let's face it, what's happening right now in Ukraine? People are fleeing and they're going to other countries. Many Ukrainian Jews are going to Israel. They're getting them out. And other people are fleeing too. Christians are having to flee some of these areas. So war will do that. So there were some survivors of this war who now fled northward into Europe. Now they're fleeing into Europe. They're not going through the area that we know as Ireland, Scotland, but now they flee northward into Europe, where the rampant red lion appears in the coat of arms of some of the nations of provinces in and around the North Sea. So now we're talking about another area. Again, people migrate. Why do you think they headed that way? Well, there were relatives there. Other survivors of the war between Troy and Greece fled westward. Now you have going north. They flee westward across the Mediterranean to, of all places, Spain. Now this is Dardan's people. And on to what we know today as Great Britain or England. And by the way, this might be very interesting to some of you in the class. A large group led by Prince Brutus, who was a direct descendant of Dardanus and Zara, lived in Italy for some time. I knew you'd be happy about that. Now please hear what I'm going to say, because this is you'll really like this, Virginia. In Italy, they established a royal line before moving on to Britain by way of Spain. Spain. I want to go back because we're going to keep referring to what God told Abraham and Sarah. He said what? He said, out of Sarah will come kings. Out of Abraham and Sarah would come kings and nations. Now, most historians believe that they arrived in Britain around the year 1100 BC. And these Trojans, descendants of Dardanus. Now, are we saying all the Trojans were descendants of Dardanus? No, we're not. But we're saying that descendants of Darda in Dardanus were from the line of Judah Zara. And they came and set up this transplanted Trojan kingdom, and that was the beginning of the British nation. Does that mean that every British person? No. And by the way, that's where the heresy of British Israelitism is wrong. We're not saying that Britain replaced, but you need to understand that as these people spread, they spread into these areas, and then I said again, what happened? They rose to prominence. Now I'm going to give you another term, and we're just about done with this. I think I see explosion signs. I'm going to give you another term. If you'll just hold on. Remember, I gave you Scythia tonight, and from Scythia is going to come another word. Now I'm going to give you another word from that time until the coming of the Saxons. Saxons. And I'm sure you've heard this term. If you'll hang with me, I'm throwing a lot at you, and we'll pull the cords on some of these together. But the Saxons, from the time that the family of Dardanus came into this area, until the coming of the Saxons into South Britain, England, we're going to keep going back to something. A rampant red lion was the emblem of all Britain. How many have seen the rampant lion as an emblem in Great Britain? So with the coming of the Saxons, its use in England as a national emblem was discontinued and was replaced by emblems brought in by the Saxons and Normans. Okay? So now you'll see different things in Britain. However, in northern Britain, which is the country of Scotland, Guess what? It is still the chief emblem. It's on the uniforms, and it's, by the way, it is on the royal emblems of the uniform. Now here's, I'm gonna give you 37 and then I'm gonna stop because we're done for the night. Because I have thrown an awful lot at you. And we went through a lot. I don't know how else to say it, we went through. And I'm gonna pick up at 37 next week, but I want, and this is fact, I want to make it very clear. The fact that the use of the rampant red lion is found in Britain, Scotland, Northern Ireland, etc., indicates, and here's the key, some, how many I said some of the people from these regions are descended from Zara, Judah. Some of them. Okay. Yeah. Questions, comments?
Tell them dumbfounded.
And by the way, we have only covered the tribes of Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. And we haven't covered Judah all, but we're almost there. Actually, we have only covered Zara, Judah. We haven't even covered the Phares Judah line, but we're going to, because it all comes together in a very beautiful way. Yes.
What's the last of 35? The Trojan kingdom is the land of the It's the last.
The beginning of the British nation. Okay, we're gonna stop here. If you want the maps, just you can either wait to get them next week, or you can get them the maps. You got your charts, right? You got your kings charts. Okay. If you're watching from home and you either want the charts of the kings of Assyria, Medo-Persian Empire, the kings of Israel and Judah, you can call me and request those. If you want a migration map that will help you trace, as we are tracing where the tribes went according to the Bible, and secondarily from historical records, you can call and request that. We are grateful that you joined us tonight, and we pray that we hear from you. If you would like to ask a question, if you have a prayer request, please feel free to call the church. We would be happy to pray with you or answer your questions. Have a blessed night, and remember that the Lord loves you and we love you too, and we would love to hear